including 1,500,000 children. And they were killed because of prejudice, intolerance, and of bigotry. I know firsthand what can happen. It can destroy nations. And through my experiences, I have learned how important it is to honor everyone, not to have prejudice, not to be intolerant, not to be a bigot. And I go as far as saying, if we understand one another, we could have a peaceful world. I wished it had been in place in the 30s and 40s, then my family, my mother and father, my young brothers, uncles, aunts, and grandmothers would have had a long life and would have died a normal death. My young brothers would have thrived, and I would not have had to go through life alone. Yes, I stayed alive, but why? It's a question I'm most often asked by my audiences. I could never give them the answer. I just didn't know why until I wrote the book. Writing it gave me the answer. It was luck in part, a set of circumstances where I stood at a given day, what time of year it was, and above all, the mood of the Nazi. But it was only because I was on Schindler's List that I, in the end, stayed alive. There was a man who made the difference. He rescued 1,100 lives, including myself. I came to his camp in November 12, 1944, from Auschwitz-Birkenau. Auschwitz was by far the worst camp one could be in. And I knew if Oskar Schindler hadn't rescued me from there, I would not be talking to you today. I speak very often in high schools, colleges, church groups, women's groups, and I do it because I don't want them to forget. I don't want them to forget that it can happen, like Professor Fried said, in an instant. And therefore we must guard it, and we must never forget. And bigotry and arrogance and hatred should not happen. Make yourself a promise that you will respect all people. And now I would like to tell you my own personal story. When I talk about my family, it's like drawing a curtain aside to days of my childhood days when I was a young girl. It all ended when I was 10 years old and Hitler came to power. Until then, we had many Jewish friends and neighbors, and our religious beliefs didn't make a difference. I was just as acquainted with Christmas and Easter as my friends and neighbors were with my holidays of Passover and Hanukkah. Religion didn't make a difference. We were children, and we played all the games children play. And then one day in 1933, Hitler came to power and changed my life completely. He riled up the masses and told him that he was going to destroy all Jews. He was going to take their possessions away, give it to them, and make sure that no Jewish people remained. And as time went on, Hitler sent his Nazi troops to the town. They marched and sang hateful songs. And people believed it. People believed everything Hitler said. And then came new edicts about every couple of weeks. And one of them was that Jews could not work. whether they were clerks or professors or doctors or street cleaners, Jews lost their jobs. All Jews lost their jobs, including my father. And then we were not allowed to ride on public transportation or sit on a park bench. Then came a day I will never forget. It was November 9th, 1938, when the Nazis burned our synagogue and all the synagogues all over Germany. I can still hear the Nazis knocking on our door to tell us to come out. My little brothers were frightened. They hid behind my mother. And so the Nazis, with clubs swinging, they took us to the site where the burning was in full progress. All the Jewish Torah scrolls, of which we had many, and prayer books, all into a pile of ashes. When the building had completely burned down, the Nazis took us to a bus depot, and I visited this bus depot several years ago with my grandson. I remember it so vividly. There in this place, they made the men dance, do calisthenics, and humiliate them in every way they could. In the afternoon, women and children were allowed to go home. My mother, my young brothers and I, we huddled together, wondering what was happening to my father. With the onset of darkness, my father returned. And this is what he had to say. He said, all the men have been sent to prison, and rumor has it that by tomorrow they will be sent to concentration camps. Why then was my father sent home? My father had served in the German army in the First World War. He had gotten the Iron Cross for bravery, and he had been severely wounded. One leg was shorter than the other. When my father told us this, we asked him why then he came home, why they didn't take him. And he could only speculate and think, perhaps they recognized him from the war. Perhaps they had served with him at one time or other. We'll never know. But this gave my father the false belief that he would be safe and nothing would happen to him. And then came a new edict. The Germans took our houses away. They took our rights to live. Everything was taken from us, and we had to live in a ghetto-like atmosphere. But because we didn't have a Jewish school anymore, it was burned down with the synagogue, and we weren't allowed to attend public school. Imagine not allowed going to school. My parents had to find ways to keep us out of trouble. That means not being sent to factories in Germany, no matter how young they were. So my brothers left first for an orphanage in Cologne, a Jewish orphanage, and there they went to school, in the Jewish school. And then it was my turn. My father found a Jewish girls' school in Berlin, and I was sent there as a student. I was terribly homesick and worried about my parents a lot, because some of my roommates had gotten notices from their parents that they had been deported to some place they didn't know, and they never heard from their parents again. And there was another reason why I was so worried. The camp they called Buchenwald was only an hour away from the city called Weimar. That's where my parents settled when they were told to leave the area for good. There was not one Jewish person that remained in the city. My father and mother were both assigned slave labor work. And because of my father's injury, it was hard for him to walk. He was not allowed to ride on public transportation. And so he used an old bicycle. The Gestapo, the secret police, they stopped him and said, "Where did you get that bicycle?" It was an old bicycle. And they took him to jail for that. When he didn't come home that night, my mother was frantic. But because it was curfew, she couldn't go and look for him. It was the next day when she went to the secret police with the special shoes my father wore and asked to be given them to him. The Nazis only laughed and said, "Your husband doesn't need shoes where he is now." And so my mother was convinced that he was already in Buchenwald. Some weeks later, I received another letter from my mother. It was a kind of farewell letter. She had gotten notice from the secret police that she and my two young brothers were going to be sent to the east, whatever that meant. They were allowed to take one suitcase and a backpack. All else had to be left behind. My mother lamented, if only your father was here, he would know what to do. When I got that letter, I was so upset. I ran out in the rain and I stumbled a few times. But at the end of that walk, I know what I had to do. I wrote a letter to the secret police and asked to be allowed to be deported with my mother and young brothers. I hastened my own destiny, but I would do it all over again because I had a few more months with my mother and brothers. They did not survive either. And so we were ready to be deported. And not one person in the city of Weimar who saw us leaving would send a greeting or look up or pity us. They just didn't look at us. And we had to assemble in an animal hall where they stripped us of everything to make sure we hadn't taken any valuables with us. And the trains already waited. And they took us for days until we stopped. And I saw the sign that said Lublin. And if I think I knew Lublin was a city in Poland. And we were made to come out of the trains. And there we were given a slip of paper that told us where we could live in the ghetto. We finally found it. It was a dilapidated building, and in it were different rooms. The room assigned to us had already another family living in it, but we had no choice. We sat on our suitcases till morning came and then registered for work. But we were still together. It wasn't until a few weeks later that in the middle of the night, a Jewish policeman knocked on our door. Yes, there were some Jewish policemen. The Nazis appointed them. They had no will of their own. They did as they were bid to do. This Jewish policeman said they needed my brother Wolfgang for some assignment and they would bring him back. They never brought him back. I never saw my brother again. I learned after the war that he had died that night in the infamous concentration camp called Majdanek. His only crime being of the Jewish faith. And now it was my brother Zeli, my youngest brother, my mother and I. Rumors went to the ghetto that he would soon be evacuated. In the meantime, I had found employment with a Nazi family. I was their nursery maid, and the two children, the two little girls, liked me very much because I had studied early childhood education for a short time in Berlin, and I knew how to play with children. But the lady of the house didn't like the idea that the girls liked me, and so I lost that job. And like my mother, I was working in an airplane factory. And then a rumor had it that the ghetto would be closed. That could only mean one thing. They had to take us out and find room for more people that were coming from Europe. Mother and I huddled together, wondering how we could save ourselves. And in the form of a rescuer came that Jewish policeman who had taken my brother. And he said, I want to help you. I want to hide you. But you all have to go into different hiding places. My mother in one, my brother in another. And he took me to a tunnel where his parents and his friends were hiding. And soon enough he heard shouting and shooting and dogs barking above us. And this went on for a few days. When everything was quiet, we came out. I went through every street in the ghetto calling, Mama, Sally, you can come out. It's all over now. But no one answered me. I never saw my mother again. She was 44 years old. And indeed, the Germans came back for us. They had anticipated that some of us would hide. They took us in big trucks and sent us to a concentration camp called it was called Butzen. And there was an Obersturmführer, that means head of the camp, who was completely mad. And those of you who have seen Schindler's List and have seen the portrait of Amon Goeth, that's how this Nazi was, just the same. And at will, he could shoot everybody. But something wonderful happened in that camp too. As I was brought into that camp, there at the entrance stood a man in a Polish Jew uniform with a three-cornered hat. He was very handsome, and he smiled at me. And for that instant, for that one instant, I thought I was in love with him and he was me. And it wasn't as if we could hold hands or talk. We had to be mindful of the gods. But Bernard Hillman was his name, and he became my husband after the war. And because he worked in the soup kitchen, he was able to give me a little soup, sometimes a boiled potato or a piece of bread, or even some warm brew that was called coffee. And these goodies helped save me strong, because the Nazis gave us very little to eat. We promised one another we would keep ourselves strong and clean so that one day we might be together. He even proposed to me, and on the back cover of my book, I'll read to you the proposal. Tell me what you remember most about Dick, most about home. I called him Dick. He asked me one evening. A lilac tree, I said. It bloomed every May about the time of Mama's birthday. My papa was so romantic. He would stand under the tree and sing songs of lilacs and love to her. The memory is so vivid in my mind, I can almost smell the lilacs now. One day, when this is over, I'll plant you a lilac bush, he said. Perhaps it will grow old and become a tree like the one you remember. For that brief moment, I allowed my heart to swell with joy. It was our habit to go the one street from one end to the other of the camp would seem, to talk with people we had gotten to know, to find out when the war would be over, or if someone would trade a piece of bread for something else, perhaps a pair of shoes. And I too did the same. And one night, as I walked someone tapped me on the shoulder and called me by my German name, which was Hannelore. And he said, Hannelore. I didn't know who he was. I had never seen him before. I thought he could be an old man, but he could be a boy as well. His clothes were ragged, and he was coughing, and I could hear the rattle that came from the cough. And again he said, Hannelore, don't you remember me? And then it dawned on me, it was my brother Sally. He had been severely beaten, and he was undernourished, and he had gone too fast. I took him to the infirmary, and within 3 days, my brother was dead. He was 14 years old and had committed no crime other than being born of the Jewish faith. He is buried in a mass grave with thousands of others. His face follows me every day of my life. I have never forgotten it. And then we were still moved to another camp, and another camp, until we landed in a place called Platov. And those of you who have seen Schindler's List, that was the place we were. And I met Dick again. I hadn't seen him for a long time. I was in a different camp in a salt mining town called Violichka. And there I had to work in the salt mines, as well as being a maid for the camp commander and his lady. One of my tasks was to bring 2 pails of water from the basement, hot water from the basement, up to the 3rd floor, so the madam could have a hot bath. I had already been in camps for 2 years. I was sluggish and I wasn't feeling well, but I did what I could. But the madam complained to the commandant and said I was lazy. So one morning, while I came up with my 2 pails of water, the commandant took them from me, doused me with hot water, and kicked me down the 3 flights of stairs. Had I broken a limb, I wouldn't be here, but luckily I didn't. And with wet shoes and a wet dress on, I was immediately sent to the salt mine. And then when our task was done, months later, I arrived in Prashov. And there I saw my future husband again. He had been so ebullient before and so full of hope, but not anymore. He had to dig up corpses, take the gold work from the teeth and hand it to a couple, to an overseer, and then throw it in another pit to burn. The stench was overwhelming, and the fear of finding a relative, a friend, was even worse. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep. And I reminded him that once he had told me to be strong, and now I'm reminding him he has to keep his promise. We saw each other almost daily by the fence, the electric wire fence. He on the men's side, I on the women's. And one day he came and he had a little smirk on his face. I wondered what that was about. And he told me there was a man in this camp by the name of Oskar Schindler. I had never heard that name and I didn't know who he was. And Dick said, 1,100 people worked for him in his factory in Krakow. The Jews had given him that factory. And now he sees what's going on here. Now he wants to help the Jews. And he's going to open a camp in Czechoslovakia. I became a little irritated and said, why are you telling me that? I don't know this man. But that's where you are wrong, he said. Your name is on that list. And then he added, Joseph Leopold is the new commander. I stood with my mouth open because Joseph Leopold was the man who had doused me with hot water and thrown me down 3 flights of stairs. To him it was only a whim. And also, my future husband was on the list. He wanted, the Nazi wanted 50 ex-Jewish Polish POWs to go also to Czechoslovakia. And we think it was a power struggle between Oskar Schindler and the commandant. And so it was that the men left. They left Pratov, and we, the women, had to make a detour to Auschwitz-Birkenau. We lived in a hut that had no roof, and water came seeping up from the bottom. I don't think we could have lived there much longer, but after a few weeks, our names were called out, and we were taken away from Auschwitz-Birkenau. We were told we were going to Oskar Schindler's camp, to Grilitz in Czechoslovakia, where Oskar Schindler would protect us. Well, our names were called out, and after the war I learned that it was Oskar Schindler who arranged this. He paid for us with gold bars for every, we were 300 women, and he paid many, many gold bars. And that's how we got out of Auschwitz. And then we came to Oskar Schindler's camp in Czechoslovakia. And there on the platform of the train stood Oskar Schindler. Someone told me, that's him, that's him. I had never seen him before. But the hated Nazi who led the camp was also there. Oskar Schindler greeted us and said, we have hot soup for you, and you will get a hot shower every week. And we did. We got towels and soap, things we had been longing for such a long time. And then, one day, the Russians came nearer, and the Germans retreated. Oskar Schindler got us all together and told us, it's over, it's almost over. Don't take the law in your own hands. Let it be done by authorities. And with that, a Russian, a Jewish man, rode into camp on a horse. He dismounted and said to us, you are free to go, and I am like you, a Hebrew. It should only befit me that I should set you free. At that moment, we all laughed and cried and screamed, all in different languages and different dialects. And we danced and said, we are free, we are free. And today I stand before you with humility and appreciation for having found a new home in the United States of America. And I hope you will remember that prejudice should not exist. Let's be friendly with everyone. Let's care for one another. That can lead to peace. I thank you all for listening. Thank you.